Last year, 13.6 million international travelers passed through Changi Airport, flooding Singapore's pristine streets with billions of dollars in foreign currency. Yet along Orchard Road, the 2.2-kilometer commercial spine of the nation, flagship cash registers sat silent. The glamorous macro indicators splashed across state headlines hide a cold, mathematical reality. Retail revenue per arrival has dropped to levels unseen in a decade. This discrepancy is not a temporary dip in consumer confidence. It is the first visible fracture in a socio-economic machine engineered to be structurally immune to failure. For 50 years, Singapore treated physical retail not as a mere commercial sector, but as an engine of national survival. At its peak, retail spending generated up to 2% of the country's gross domestic product, anchoring an economic architecture that transformed a land-scarce island into a global consumption sanctuary. The state leased land with mathematical precision, calculating exactly how many square meters of air-conditioned space were required to extract maximum capital from every passing tourist. Megastructures arose across the urban landscape, designed as frictionless loops where transit, entertainment, and commerce fused into a single high-yield matrix. The bedrock of this system relied on two distinct corporate pillars: centralized institutional developers and fragmented strata-titled owners. In the early boom years of the 1970s and 1980s, the strata-title model allowed hundreds of independent citizens to buy individual shop lots inside a single building, democratic capitalism cast in raw concrete. Properties like the Tanglin Shopping Centre and the Peace Centre emerged from this blueprint, capturing massive foot traffic and generating immediate cash flows for thousands of small-scale retailers. For decades, the formula worked perfectly because the underlying asset, the land itself, steadily appreciated beneath their feet. But as the global economy shifted toward hyper-financialization, the rules of Singapore real estate underwent a quiet, radical rewriting. Real estate investment trusts, known as REITs, entered the market, introducing a brutal philosophy of performance per square foot. These multi-billion-dollar funds began treating urban spaces like factory assembly lines, demanding predictable, escalating quarterly yields to satisfy international shareholders. Suddenly, a shopping mall was no longer a community hub or a venue for local commerce. It became a financial instrument that required constant optimization. This institutional pressure immediately exposed a fatal systemic contradiction between centralized corporate capital and fragmented individual ownership. In older strata-titled buildings, the ownership of a single structure remained splintered among hundreds of aging individuals, each holding veto power over upgrades. To replace a failing cooling tower or modernize a dim 1970s electrical grid required absolute consensus, an intangible asset that proved far too expensive to acquire. While corporate-backed megamalls underwent rapid, light-flooded renovations to capture changing consumer tastes, the fragmented sanctuaries stagnated, turning into dark architectural anomalies simultaneously. The physical nature of consumer gravity changed entirely. The modern consumer ceased navigating urban geography merely to purchase physical goods that could be delivered to a smartphone screen within 24 hours. They demanded integrated experiences, medical centers, enrichment hubs, and hyper-curated dining concepts under one roof. Small and mid-sized neighborhood complexes lack the physical volume to house massive anchor tenants like supermarket chains or multiplex cinemas, stripping them of their natural customer pull. The consequences of this structural lag manifested first as an invisible rot, then as an undeniable physical exodus. In properties like the Upper Serangoon Shopping Centre, maintenance budgets dwindled to near zero as rental income collapsed, trapped in a downward spiral of passive maintenance. The rattling of obsolete air conditioning units and the flicker of dim yellow fluorescent tubes marked the exact coordinates where the market had withdrawn its capital. Major global brands bypassed these dead zones as if they carried a structural contagion, migrating exclusively to centralized, REIT-managed mega-labyrinths. By 2023, the system reached its flashpoint, and the state-backed market chose to wipe the slate clean rather than sustain a dying model. The executioner's tool of choice was the en bloc mechanism, a collective sale process where corporate syndicates buy out fragmented owners to completely demolish the existing concrete. The first major monument to fall was J-Cube, the commercial heartbeat of Western Singapore, home to the nation's only Olympic-sized ice rink. Despite its flawless location adjacent to a major transit interchange, its late 90s design was deemed too inefficient for the modern spreadsheet. In August 2023, the rink was closed, the concrete smashed, and the site cleared for Jadon, a hyper-luxury residential skyscraper. The laughter of families was replaced by the calculated valuation of high-end square footage, marking a definitive shift in the national priority. Land had become too expensive to waste on community entertainment, and the corporate engine began consuming its own history to maintain its financial momentum. This was not an isolated redevelopment project. It was the opening salvo of a structural purge sweeping across the entire island. On Orchard Road itself, legacy landmarks like Delphi Orchard began teetering on the edge of institutional elimination, unable to match the revenue density of their glass and steel neighbors. The failure-proof nation had built a retail empire of unprecedented scale, but the very mechanisms used to engineer that perfection were now turning inward. The foundations of the shopping dream had fractured, and the true cost of this hyper-efficient liquidation was about to be laid bare. The economic friction began inside the cash flow spreadsheets of the global retail brands themselves. High-paying international tourists still walked the polished granite floors of Orchard Road, but their psychological profile had mutated. Data from the Singapore Tourism Board revealed a stark divergence. While overall visitor spending hit $27 billion, the percentage allocated strictly to shopping plummeted by 30%. Travelers from mainland China, previously the financial bedrock of the luxury sector, redirected their capital toward experiential consumption, concerts, wellness, and culinary curation. The multi-story fashion flagship, designed exclusively to move physical inventory across a mahogany counter, became a monument to a vanished demographic. This shift in spending habits instantly triggered a structural crisis for the country's real estate investment trusts. Under strict national regulatory frameworks, Singapore REITs must distribute at least 90% of their taxable income to shareholders to maintain their tax-exempt status. This legislative mandate leaves no financial buffer for market downturns. When retail sales dropped, institutional landlords could not lower rents to preserve tenants. Doing so would compress their distributions and trigger an immediate sell-off on the Singapore Exchange. Instead, they enacted a predatory countermeasure, the implementation of gross turnover rent structures. The gross turnover mechanism combined a high baseline rent with a percentage-based tax on every transaction processed inside the store. Landlords installed point-of-sale integration systems to monitor vendor revenues in real time. For mid-tier retailers already struggling against direct-to-consumer digital channels, this double extraction model compressed profit margins to absolute zero. To survive, international fashion chains began consolidating their footprints, terminating leases across multiple secondary malls to anchor themselves in a single, high-visibility flagship. This migration left thousands of square meters of premium retail space vacant. Simultaneously, the sudden spike in vacancy rates immediately breached the debt covenants of the property assets. Commercial banks calculate loan-to-value ratios based on capitalized rental income. As occupancy fell, the paper value of the malls collapsed. Institutional owners found themselves forced to inject massive cash reserves to rebalance their leverage ratios. To stop the hemorrhage, developers attempted to rapidly repurpose empty retail wings into lifestyle zones, flooding spaces with indoor playgrounds, gymnasiums, and co-working spaces. This tactical pivot, intended as salvation, only accelerated the structural degradation. Lifestyle tenants consumed drastically more utility resources while generating a fraction of the revenue density provided by luxury boutiques. A fitness center or an indoor climbing wall requires continuous high-volume air conditioning and heavy electrical loads, yet pays up to 60% less rent per square foot than a cosmetics counter. Between 2022 and 2026, Singapore's industrial electricity tariffs escalated due to global energy market volatility. Malls found their operational expenses expanding exponentially at the exact moment their primary revenue streams contracted. The infrastructure was burning more capital simply to keep the lights on. Simultaneously, A severe labor crisis paralyzed day-to-day operations. The Ministry of Manpower systematically tightened the foreign worker quota framework, raising the minimum salary thresholds for S-Pass and employment pass holders. The retail sector, heavily reliant on frontline non-resident labor to man cash registers and manage stockrooms, faced immediate staff depletion. Brands cut operating hours, closed entire floors during weekdays, and replaced interactive customer service with automated kiosks. The frictionless, high-touch luxury experience that defined Singapore's global reputation vanished. Replaced by an ambient sense of neglect, this operational decay triggered an immediate exodus of domestic consumers. The local population, facing a goods and services tax increase to 9%, executed a massive behavioral pivot toward digital borderless commerce. E-commerce platforms bypassed the physical constraints of local real estate entirely, offering direct-from-factory pricing that domestic brick-and-mortar stores could not match due to their built-in overhead costs. Orchard Road was no longer a marketplace for locals. It had devolved into a physical catalogue where consumers browsed items in store only to purchase them online from overseas warehouses. The final systemic trap closed around the remaining strata title complexes that attempted to escape this spiral through a collective liquidation. Historically, the en bloc mechanism served as the ultimate safety valve, allowing fragmented owners to sell an entire building to an aggressive developer for complete reconstruction. But the macroeconomic environment of 2024 to 2026 transformed this escape route into a financial dead end. The Monetary Authority maintained elevated interest rates to combat persistent inflation, driving the cost of corporate construction loans to prohibitive heights. Developers could no longer justify multi-hundred-million-dollar land acquisitions when the cost of capital outpaced projected retail yields. En bloc tenders at major commercial hubs failed to attract single bids, collapsing in public view. Strata owners who had withheld maintenance funding in anticipation of a massive payout found themselves trapped inside rapidly depreciating assets. The physical infrastructure entered a phase of terminal neglect. Elevators remained broken for months, facade tiles cracked under tropical humidity, and basement levels succumbed to persistent drainage failures. The crisis had outgrown the boundaries of individual corporate balance sheets. The failure-proof urban matrix was locked in a self-reinforcing loop, where high real estate valuations demanded high rents drove out productive commerce, and the resulting vacancies invalidated the underlying wealth of the financial system itself. The mechanism was still spinning, but the gears were grinding against empty air, generating nothing but heat and debt. The system had passed its structural threshold, and the entire architecture of the national economy stood exposed to the approaching shockwave. The devaluations inside the commercial real estate sector have breached the defensive perimeter of the domestic banking system. Singapore's three dominant banking institutions, DBS, OCBC and UOB, face a contracting collateral base as the asset values of secondary commercial properties drop by an estimated 15 to 20% across the urban core. When the physical structure securing a $100 million loan loses its valuation, the financial institution must adjust its risk weightings. This adjustment restricts corporate credit lines across the wider economy, raising borrowing costs for non-retail sectors. The retail rot has successfully converted itself into a systemic credit squeeze. Meanwhile, the state's massive influx of foreign wealth has failed to act as a macroeconomic stabilizer. By 2026, the number of single-family offices managing billionaire wealth in Singapore surpassed 1,500, holding hundreds of billions in assets under management. Yet this capital operates in a sterile financial layer completely detached from the physical street level. Under local tax incentive schemes like the 130U and 130V frameworks, these funds deploy their liquidity into global equities, private credit, and sovereign bonds. They do not purchase local consumer inventory, they purchase static financial instruments. The wealth of the nation grows on paper, while the velocity of money on the ground slows to a crawl. To arrest this fragmentation, the Urban Redevelopment Authority deployed the Strategic Development Incentive Scheme. This policy offers a major structural bribe. Landlords receive up to 20% bonus plot ratio if they consolidate adjacent older properties and rebuild them into integrated, mixed-use complexes. The state intended this blueprint to force immediate transformation along Orchard Road, targeting aging monoliths like Orchard Towers and Tanglin Shopping Centre. But the strategy arrived too late to outrun the macroeconomic reality of elevated global interest rates. Consolidating fragmented, strata-titled property requires multi-year negotiations, during which the cost of holding debt destroys the eventual development margin. Private developers cannot execute these massive capital expenditure projects when construction material costs have inflated by 25% since the pandemic era. The state's incentive scheme remains an unused bureaucratic framework, a collection of empty permissions that no private balance sheet can afford to weaponize. Capital has simply calculated that demolition and high-end residential conversion yield faster cash-sharp returns than long-term retail revival. This math has triggered a permanent reduction in the physical footprint of the city's commercial space. Over 400,000 square feet of retail zone have been permanently erased from the master plan over the last 36 months. The urban core is reorganizing itself into a highly stratified landscape. The mid-tier retail ecosystem that once sustained the local middle class is vanishing entirely, replaced by two extreme typologies: hyper-exclusive, secure private residential compounds on one end, and highly automated, windowless digital fulfillment warehouses tucked into the industrial fringes of Tuas and Changi. The human cost of this structural shrinkage falls entirely upon the domestic workforce. Retail trade historically functioned as the country's third largest employer, providing low barrier entry points for tens of thousands of local workers and older citizens. As physical stores close or automate, these jobs disappear permanently from the National Labour Registry. The displaced workforce cannot easily transition into the high-tech, algorithmic economy of the family offices or biomedical hubs. This creates a quiet, domestic labour surplus, compressing wages in the domestic service sector and accelerating wealth polarization within a population already facing escalating costs of living. Geopolitically, Singapore's structural retail crisis compromises its position as the undisputed capital of Southeast Asian consumption. Regional competitors have analyzed the city-state's vulnerabilities and engineered their own high-margin alternatives. Bangkok has deployed mega destinations like Iconium that integrate luxury retail with low-cost operational overhead, while Tokyo utilizes a depreciated currency to attract international luxury spenders at a 40% discount relative to Orchard Road prices. The international capital that once viewed Singapore as an inescapable toll gate for regional wealth is bypassing the island entirely, rerouting its physical spending toward markets where the operational costs do not strangulate the consumer experience. The institutional attempts to salvage the old model through grand architectural upgrades reveal a deep structural fragility. The state recently approved multi-billion-dollar expansions for integrated resorts like Marina Bay Sands, wagering that ultra-luxury casinos and high-capacity convention centers can substitute for the structural decay of traditional shopping streets. But this strategy concentrates national tourism revenue into a microscopic corporate duopoly, leaving the wider urban landscape starved of organic economic activity. If the massive casino complexes face a regional regulatory shift or an external macroeconomic shock, the nation possesses no secondary commercial safety net to absorb the impact. The mechanism that built Singapore's economic miracle has reached its physical and mathematical limit. The 20th century strategy of using mass physical retail as a primary engine of gross domestic product cannot be revived through minor rent adjustments or cosmetic facade renovations. The structural forces of global digital commerce, expensive capital, and irreversible wealth concentration have shattered the older loops of urban consumption. The silent, empty hallways of the country's former retail sanctuaries are not waiting for a recovery. They are the permanent physical monuments to an economic model that has run out of space, run out of consumers, and run out of time.